So, April is over, which means I'm here for your whistle-stop tour of everything I read this month. We are going to go from DNFs to 5 stars in that order, and I'm going to give you bullet point summaries of what the books were about. My star rating and then whether I would recommend them or not. We're going to start with Spare by Prince Harry. This is a DNF. This was identical to the Netflix documentary as far as I'm concerned, and I wasn't interested enough. So bullet point wise, you get far too much detail, just a full-blown memoir and a lot of grief over his mum dying, which is entirely reasonable, but I didn't want to read about it. I would recommend this to people who are hardcore royalists. Number 2 was How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This was a DNF, so my bullet points are going to be very short and sweet because I didn't get very far into the book. Haunted house, dead relative, what's the word? Tricky sibling dynamics. I wouldn't recommend this to anyone because I DNF'd it. Number 3 was Dungeons and Do-Rags by Ron Dawson. This is a DNF. I found it on Scribd. It's a memoir. I need to stop wiggling this pen. It was a memoir. Bullet points would be... No, you know what? No bullet points for this one because it's so weird I can't just sum it up in bullet points. I never got to the point where he explained who he was or why he was a particular person of interest. The main thing to note is that the memoir is all told from his perspective, but with commentary from fictional Samuel L. Jackson and Viola Davis. As in, Ron Dawson puts in what he thinks those two would say about what he is saying in his book, which was entertaining to start with, but it just kept going on and on and on. Maybe I just wasn't reading the audiobook fast enough, but yeah, it was interesting to start and then not so much, so I DNF'd it. I would recommend this to people who are interested in obscure memoirs. Yeah. My next one, oh my god, my next one, stressful, that'll do. My next one was The Lost Sisters by Holly Black. This is a novella that pertains to the Cruel Prince series, which I have read, so I figured why not. It's only 150 pages long. It's only an ebook. I don't know if you can get like a physical copy. I don't know. Read it in one sitting. It was not necessary. It was unnecessary. You didn't need to read it. All of the information in this novella was implied in the books, so you didn't need it, so whatever. This is a 3-star because, like, it was well written, it just didn't need to be written. So you have forbidden love story, sibling dynamics, and yeah, that was about it. I wouldn't recommend this necessarily to anyone unless you are a hardcore Holly Black fan. My next one was Ring Shout by P. Jelly Clark. I apologise if I'm pronouncing that wrong. This was a novella I found on Scribd about people who hunted the KKK because in this world the KKK could mutate or transform into these actual horrible monsters, like bestial monsters. Bullet points, cool characters. I like the characters in this. Tugged heartstrings. And gore. Lots of gore. I gave this one 3 stars. It was interesting, but it was a cool concept, but the story itself wasn't that interesting, and I didn't love the chosen one trope. I would recommend this to politically inclined horror enthusiasts. My next one, I read The Strange Library by Murakami. It was a strange novella. It was my first Murakami, and it was, how do I describe it? It's really hard. Unreliable characters, libraries, and just utter confusion. Like I was utterly confused. I would recommend this to people who like to be confused by their books. The next one I read was The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. This is one of the accompanying trilogies to the Mortal Instruments series. It's got cults, humour, and action and like teenage romance. I say teenage, one of them is a teenager, one of them is like 300 years old. I don't love it, but here we are. I think I rated this at 3 stars. I would recommend this to fans of Cassandra Clare or teenagers who like fantasy. Next, I read Sex Cult Nun. This was another Scribd find. This is about a woman who grew up in a sex cult. It's not quite as heavily a sex cult as you would think. It's just a cult where affection and love and physical intimacy is seen as something that should be shared amongst everyone. So trigger warnings for child abuse, sexual harassment, any of the sexual trigger warnings you can think of. Also, it's set mostly in Asia, so it's from the point of view of like cultists in Asia and then moving around and the dynamics of how that works. Quite interesting. So another memoir. It's memoir, international cults and cult politics as well. It's heavy on that front. Yeah, I would recommend it to anyone that likes reading about cults. It's pretty interesting. Following that theme, I then read Beyond Belief, My Secret Life Inside Scientology by Jenna Miscavige, who is the head of Scientology's niece. Similar themes, just about her growing up in Scientology and what that meant and how things changed as she got older and her beliefs started to wobble a little bit, and how she eventually got out of Scientology and stayed out. I would recommend this to people, again, who like reading about cults. If you were like me and were hoping for more like name drops, there aren't that many name drops. There are just like the big ones and then some I've never heard of because I'm not American. Then following on the non-fiction theme, though we're leaving cults behind, I read Disfigured on fairy tales, disability and making space. This was really interesting. This is, I guess, a series of essays. It's like a reflective novel on disability in fairy tales and then how we think about disability based on what we see in fairy tales. I rated it 4 stars. If you are at all interested in disability in literature, fairy tales and how we think about them, or just learning more about disability and various disabilities and how they're portrayed, this is definitely a book for you, and that is who I'd recommend the book to as well. I rated this 4 stars. Then I read The Witches of Vardo. This is a book about, it's a historical fiction with fantasy implications, so magical realism, is that what we call that? Set in Denmark/Norway. There is some travel in it and I wasn't entirely sure where we were, but it's about 3 or 4 women. Some are accused of witchcraft, some are sent away for various reasons that I won't spoil, but they all end up in this fortress of Vardo where they are kept under lock and key, and eventually some of them will be tried for witchcraft. This is a horrifically sad, heart-wrenching, just so upsetting, incredibly gory at times that I wasn't expecting. This book packs a punch, and I think a lot of it is because this is based on a true story. There's a bit at the end where the author has all the names and the information about what we actually knew about the trials, the witchcraft trials that happened in Vardo. And I thought it was really interesting just because quite often we hear about the Salem witch trials a lot. We don't often hear about the Western ones, or if we do, we don't ever hear about the ones that happen outside of Britain. So this was a really interesting book to read. I'd recommend this for history buffs or people who just want another spin on witchcraft trials, witch trials, that sort of thing. Oh my goodness. Then I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is about Emily Wilde, who is a researcher. She travels to a small Scandinavian village to study some of their local fairies, essentially, and is unexpectedly joined by her associate Bumblebee. Wendell Bumblebee? I think that was it. There's lots of alls in it. And it's about how she encounters the Fae and what she does when she meets the Fae and how the Fae affect the village, and is humorous and light-hearted. I rated this 4 stars because I was slightly disappointed because it didn't do what I wanted, but as a book it is very good. So if you are a fantasy reader and you like reading about pixies and fae, or if you have been reading a lot about sort of fae courts and books about fae court politics and all of that, and you want a break, read Emily Wilde, because it doesn't really deal with any of that. It's literally just about how fae exist in our world. It is very cosy. Yeah, rated it 4 stars. Next I read Black Sun. I read this on audiobook originally and then got myself the physical copy. This is a fantasy following 3, then 4 points of view. It is political. It is heavy on the fantasy religion front. The author, Rebecca Roanhorse, she is Indigenous, so there's a lot of Indigenous rep in this book. There's a lot of LGBT rep, there's a lot of disability rep, and as far as I can tell, it is all done really well. All the characters are really interesting and different and well fleshed out, and I would recommend this to people who read fantasy, specifically epic fantasy, but want something different from your typical epic fantasy, because it definitely delivers on that front. Very good. I rated this 5 stars. Next on my list I have the Anita Blake series. So I started with Guilty Pleasures, and then I read The Laughing Corpse. Anita Blake is a 29 book series about Anita Blake, who is a vampire hunter and also an animator, so she can raise bodies from the dead. And it's about her and her sort of taking on jobs and being entangled in the local vampire society and various other people, powerful people, who come into her life and try and push her around and start throwing things out the window. And so far I've only read two of the books, but at the moment they have both been very fast paced. They've both been very vampire and zombie heavy. They've also been incredibly gory. Please look up the trigger warnings for these books. I will say that the first 2 books were written in the 90s, and some of that shows in the writing. There is some problematic language that is a product of its time. So I'm hoping as the series goes on, that will die down. I rated them both 5 stars. I would recommend them to people who are sick of reading vampire books where humans fall in love with vampires, because that is very much not what Anita Blake is doing at the moment. I hope that doesn't go that way. Then we've got Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. And this is quite an old book. I don't know why I hadn't read this before. I read Uprooted and hated it. I read some of the Scholomance series and loved it. And then I figured I'd try this one because why not? I absolutely love this book. It is heavily influenced by fairy tales. I would argue it is, yeah, it's a retelling of fairy tales from 3 different points of view of 3 different women in very different circumstances. And I have not read a book with a plot this intricate and well fleshed out in such a long time. It is so clever, it is so detail oriented, and even though you know the fairy tales that she is pulling on, you don't know how it's going to end and you don't know how things are going to roll out, and that is why I gave it 5 stars. I would highly recommend this to anyone who wants to read a book with a twist on normal fairy tales, or wants to revisit some of the fairy tales that they read as a child but with an adult centred focus. And last on my list I have The Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson. This is an accompanying novella to Sorcery of Thorns, which I also rated 5 stars, and this is just 5 stars, fantastic. It is a novella that adds something to the original plot. It's not just a cash grab. The characters are exactly as they were and they progress even more. We get a better look at one of the characters we didn't get a good enough look at in the first book. It's got a self-contained plot that is quite clever, a little bit predictable, but that's fine. I rated it 5 stars just for pure enjoyment, coziness, nostalgia factor for reading this book. And yeah, that was every book that I read or started to read in April. Thank you for watching this whistle stop tour.